So excited to be here today with Nandini to talk about just how amazing she is, because she is incredible, about her story in building her company, about her thoughts on self-confidence, especially for women, and just more about her journey as a young advocate. So I'll let her introduce herself real quick and we'll dive into the interview.
Yeah, well, first of all, thank you, Ainsley, for this amazing opportunity. So, to all you folks out there, my name is Nandini, and I'm currently a freshman here at UNC Chapel Hill, and also a co-founder among four of an amazing project called Sensible. And what essentially it is it's a diagnostic menstrual pad that we've created to provide communities that are often underserved and don't have access to conventional healthcare diagnostics with a way to screen for cervical diseases at a very, very low cost.
Amazing. Just the way that you came up with such an innovative way to address that issue is so cool to me. And I think that really is the mark of a leader, someone who can think outside the box and isn't afraid to chase after what it seems like an unconventional idea. So props to you.
Thank you so much. And like I said, like 100%, it's because of the people that I did it with. I don't think it would have been
Mhm.
possible. It's very much a kudos to
That's
that I launched this with.
that's awesome. And yeah, again, leadership does depend a lot on the team that you work with. So I love that. And I definitely want to talk about that more later in the interview. But I want to start just by talking about recognizing that you are a young person in STEM, and I'm sure that has definitely played a role in your attempts to advocate for your company and yourself and why you matter. So I'm just curious about your thoughts on how do you think your identity as not just a woman but also a young person has played a role in your advocacy?
I think being young, it gives you a lot of perspective and a sense of, well, actually, I take that back. I think it's because you don't have a lot of experience to kind of guide, like things should be a certain way, or you should execute certain practices a certain way, talk to people a certain way. Like there's like XYZ to like with respect to a method that you always have to follow. And I think being young allows you to kind of experiment a little bit. I think be very like don't not being afraid. I think about things that you try to implement or risks that you take. Being young, I think there's both an advantage and a disadvantage of the advantage obviously being that when you're young you can try things without the pressures of thinking about a family or thinking about other responsibilities that you have. But obviously there's a disadvantage of people not taking you seriously enough.
Mm-hmm.
It's nice to be able to prove them wrong a little bit. um, I can do what you're doing too, maybe even a little bit better.
I agree. I think there is this, the ageism is there, but sometimes you can wield it to your advantage, use the shock factor of sorts to make your impact even more powerful. And I like what you said about the way that young people are more willing to take risks because we aren't yet uh, conditioned sort of to to follow the way that things should be or what's right, what society says should be true, because we haven't yet been as exposed to the things that society wants us to do. And I agree with that. And I feel like especially with your line of work, it is a lot of taking risks and just seeing what happens if you take a certain direction instead of another. Um, how do you think risk taking really has impacted your journey in building your company?
Yeah, I think a big thing would probably be kind of, I will say sometimes the risks that I take aren't probably very valid. I think that's probably the biggest risk of them all, not really knowing what the outcome would be.
Mhm.
Say maybe one of the biggest risks that we've taken. I feel like kind of executing on this project like as a whole. It's like to start a biotech startup. at an age where like you don't have any credentials. There's like we don't have a PhD or an MD or any sort of degree to back up what we're doing, nor are we backed by an institution of any sort, or anything like that. And to go out into the world and be like, hey, we have this device that we're trying to create, and we need you to trust that it's going to do what we say it's going to do. And I think with that, it's a lot about building credibility through the people that we connect with. So really, really
Mhm.
leaning into the support of the community here at UNC and at other institutions around the country, and really, really using that network. I think that's the biggest advice I would probably give to anybody is to um, kind of talk to as many people as you can, because you're going to learn a lot.
I love that. Yeah, networking is one of my favorite things to do because I agree with you. There are just so many resources out there, and you should take advantage of them because they're not going to come find you. You have to go find the opportunities. And I want to go back to what you said about the credentials aspect of it because I think that's something that's really poignant, especially for women, that feeling that you have to prove yourself, you have to prove that you belong in the space. And a large part of that is we live in a culture where credentials are seen as a sign of experience and a sign of expertise and a sign of trustworthiness when, as you obviously show, young people can be just as well spoken, just as powerful leaders, even if they don't have a PhD. So it seems to me it's more about the ability to understand how to work in a team, the ability to pursue problems and not be daunted um, by the barriers that you encounter, rather than having had 5, 6, 7, 8 years of education that somehow tells people that you're credible.
Oh, yeah, 100%. And I think with that, it takes a lot of belief, I think, to trust that. I think there's also a sense of insecurity um, that other people project onto you, but also kind of one that you project onto yourself. Kind of,
Mhm.
like, are we as a team really capable of taking this on and executing it, like doing justice to the dream that we have? And with that, it's almost, it's just you have to keep the faith. You have to trust that like you're going to make mistakes. It's not going to be perfect. Like you're going to mess up, and you have to be willing to own up to those mistakes and kind of bounce back. Like don't give up, especially I think when you're young. That's a very easy thing to do. um,
How do you think that's impacted the particular line of work that you've been involved in? Because what you're doing is not only building something, you're also challenging societal stigmas at the very same time with your work in menstrual health and menstrual equity. So I'm curious, what are your thoughts on that aspect? How risk taking and not being afraid to make mistakes has sort of impacted the way that you've approached this sensitive subject?
Yeah, so I think with the big thing there, to me, and I think the team, it doesn't feel as much of a risk to us, because this is something that, through this product and putting it out there, it's very, very important to us that we're telling the story and all of the nitty
Mhm.
gritty parts, the parts that are very easy to talk about and the parts that are very, very uncomfortable to talk about. So I think it's not very much a risk from our end. Like we are more than happy to talk about it. About changing the narrative and making people feel more comfortable talking about it like we are. But I think, that's not always the mindset that the people, we talk to and conversate with have. And so, and I'll tell you, like, there have been multiple experiences, I think, when whether we've been to conferences or at different meetings or people we've talked to, when we are pitching our product to them or when we're kind of presenting maybe like a visual of what the product looks like and what are the mechanisms of it. And we put a picture of the uterus up there or, like a diagram or some sort of depiction of menstruation or something of that sort. We've numerous times we've experienced a lot of backlash of, maybe don't put that image there. It's going to make the audience a little queasy. It's going to make them uncomfortable. I think on multiple accounts we've been asked to, like, we weren't allowed to put pictures of like a pad with like a splotch of red on it on our slides,
So
or yeah, or when we filed
interesting.
an approval, yeah, or like a proposal with our county, back in high school when we started the project, with the
Hmm.
county to be like, hey, we're a group of students pursuing this project. We need some financial help from you. They asked us to remove the words menstrual blood from the title. And I was like, sir, that is very, like, that is essentially what, that's very core to what, so,
Yeah.
to remove it isn't, I don't think very fair, but also like
Hmm.
incredibly um, not representative of what we're trying to do. And so I think it's very important that um, I feel like, yes, there are people out there that are uncomfortable talking about it. But if we show that you don't have to be uncomfortable, like you can talk about this is a normal bodily process. Like it's a process that over 50% of the world goes through every month. And there are still people who don't know what it is or fully have a full understanding of what it is, especially even the people who experience it. And so I feel like that has a lot to say about the community and kind of where it is right now. And I will say it's getting better. There are a lot of people that are a lot more receptive to these kinds of conversations. I remember very vividly after a presentation we gave at MIT at a conference called Eureka Fest
Hmm.
last um, after our presentation, there was maybe a man, like he was maybe 40, something around that age. A 40-year-old man kind of came up to us and was like, oh my God, I did not know that, in parts of the world, women were banished to menstruation huts, or, some were killed or attacked for, when someone else caught them with a soiled pad, or, harassed of any sort. And he was like, I had no idea that this was the state of, women's health in the world. And, my
Hmm.
wife goes through this every month too, and I just had no idea. I would love to learn more. Do you have any resources for where I can look towards? Um,
Hmm.
it was such a small thing, and I think, but incredibly validating, I will
Oh,
say.
I can imagine.
I think to be able to talk about a project that we're so passionate about and see a response like that from the community. And it wasn't just him, throughout the next couple of months and previous months before that, we would get similar responses. We would, you know, it's almost a very emotional, touchy subject. But when
Hmm.
we talk about it as equals and as almost partners of a community where we support each other no matter our gender, no matter our bodily condition, it's about equity, and equity not just with respect to healthcare resources for those that experience menstruation, but equity in terms of knowledge. And so I think that's very much a big pillar to sensible and kind of the narrative that we're pushing and what we want to put out there.
I love that. And there's just so much to unpack from what you said. First of all, I love that story about the man because I think that really does speak to a lot of the issues just around women in general, in that men just don't know about some of these things. And people just don't know about some of these things because nobody is talking about them. And whether that's from just discomfort, like with menstruation, or just fear of backlash. And it sounds like what we need is we need people like you who are speaking out about them, not in an accusatory way, saying like, "Oh, you should have known this," but hey, have you realized this? Have you taken a moment to think about this? Um, and so yeah, so that's really really inspiring to hear. There's this one piece of what you were saying at the very beginning when you were talking about how you're not afraid to speak out about it. And just out of curiosity, when you do encounter these situations where people sort of try and quiet your voice, like when you were talking about the presentations where people say, "Hey, take that away," how does that feel when people try to change the way that you are advocating? And what do you do in those situations? What have you done in those situations?
I think it's kind of sticking to your guns. When you're kind of asked to take a step back and change your narrative, it's hard to, like, I mean, in times it feels almost easy to succumb
Mhm.
to that. Okay, whatever you want, as long as, I get to speak about this to some extent, right? A little versus absolutely nothing. Um, but I think, like, you shouldn't let somebody else tell your story. And to every single person, your story is very, very core to who you are, and sensible story is very, very core to who we are. And so I think it's all about just pushing through and being like, if they come at you and they say, we don't want these graphics, or we don't want you to say this word, or can you kind of skim over this? I feel like, the audience isn't going to really sit well with it. Um, who cares? Kind of, and
I love that.
yeah, and I feel like sometimes like it feels, I will say especially because when you're young, you feel like you take what you can get and you're going,
Hmm.
it's very much easier to kind of succumb to their demands and be like, whatever you want, and kind of compromise, what you want to say. Um, but I think it's even more powerful when someone young says, you know, I don't like, just as much as like, I'm not going to tell you how to do your job. Don't tell me how to do mine, kind of thing. And I
Hmm.
think there's balance there. There's very much a difference between being disrespectful and also sticking to your guns and kind of following through on the story that you're putting out into the world. And
Hmm.
I don't think it's disrespectful for us to tell our story the way we want to tell it, because otherwise it's incomplete. Then what are we even doing there?
Hmm.
So that's the advice. Stick to your guns, and try to convince them. Like, don't be inflammatory about it. Just kind of respectfully be like, you know, I understand your point of view, but I do feel like this is a very valuable part of the conversation that we need to have, and they'll
Hmm.
understand. And like, I like to believe that giving people the benefit of the doubt is always a fair thing. And
Hmm.
so don't back away from what you want to say and what you believe.
I love that. I love that you mentioned it in terms of everyone has a story and you don't want to tell an incomplete story. And I like that because I think that does really speak to how when we try and silence the voices of women, we are shaping this narrative of what it means to be a woman in a way that doesn't do justice to all of it. We hear about, oh, women advancing in STEM, this is great, but then or there are organizations that are like, you should get into STEM, here are all the great things about being in STEM, but once you actually get into the STEM workplace, then you realize there's a lot more to it, that the story just is not being told about the sexism and sexual harassment and discrimination and bias, all of these things that don't get talked about because there are people succumbing to those same pressures that you have felt of trying to, that they're trying to quiet their voices, quiet that part of the story, so that we have this image of what society wants us to see, what society wants us to talk about when it comes to women's health in your case, and then the reality. And being a trailblazer, someone like you who is trying to showcase that other half of the story, I'm sure can be frightening at times. But you seem to be very brave, very, very tough. And just out of curiosity, are there any specific strategies that you try to implement when you're advocating for yourself, when you're in these tough situations where you're having to fight for yourself and stick to your guns? Because it's easy to say, oh, just be bold and don't let anybody walk over you, but when you're in that moment, it can be a lot harder than it sounds. So are there any specific things that you tend to do that work for you?
I think it's a lot about confidence. I will
Mm-hmm.
say, and I can say it's easier than that because confidence is very much a hard thing to come by. But I think
Mm-hmm.
it's, again, about believing in yourself and the vision that you're trying to put out there. Um, for me, my brain always goes like, it's kind of extreme, but it's like, if I say this thing, is it going to be the end of the world? And
Mm-hmm.
most, like, almost 99.9% of the time, it's not. So my brain goes, okay, why the heck not? Let's go for it. So like, I do know that I think it's Michael Jordan that said this, but you miss 100% of the chances you don't take. And
Mm-hmm.
I guess that's a cliche for a reason because it's very true. And so I think really just believe in what you're trying to do, and confidence. If you sound like you know what you're talking about, then they're going to trust you implicitly about what you're talking about, at least a little bit more than they would otherwise. And so always just take chances, take risks. Don't be afraid to make a mistake. Also, I think making mistakes are the biggest lesson teachers. And I will tell you, I have made a shitload of mistakes. I don't know if I'm allowed to curse. Sorry,
That's
um,
okay.
but I have, and I'm not afraid to admit it, because for each and every single one of them, I've come back, um, I've bounced back, and I think that's another one of the things that I will say, when you take risks, and sometimes when you're wrong, don't be afraid to admit that, because when you try to cover it up, then you
Mhm.
come to credibility. Um, so it's definitely a give and take.
That's a really good point. I really like that about embracing your mistakes. I'm reading this book right now called Dare to Lead, and it's talks a lot about that, about how vulnerability is so important to being a leader because not only does it showcase that you are willing to trust and you are willing to put yourself out there, but also encourages others um, to start to try and be that open as well. And one of the things that I definitely want to talk with you is persistence and resilience and how that's played a role in your journey. So I'm glad we made it to that topic. Um, and so, it sounds like basically your guiding principle is be authentically you in every part of who you are, whether there are some parts of you that the world thinks should be quieted, ignore them and embrace who you are fully and don't let your mistakes drag you down. Don't weigh in on your mistakes, but use them as things to learn from and indications of places where you have room to grow. Um, would you add anything to that sort of characterization?
I think that that sums it up pretty nicely. Um, and I don't know, just don't be afraid. Go for it, for sure.
I love that. As we're sort of wrapping up here, I'd love to talk more about what you mentioned at the beginning, which was the team and how working as a team has been invaluable for you. So, how has being a part of a team helped you in building your confidence and advocating for yourself and what you're doing?
I will definitely say to come by a team that works so well together, that understands each other in a way that's supportive, but also in a way that is constructively critical, is very, very important. And to find that kind of healthy balance is very, very rare. And I feel incredibly lucky to have found that. I definitely think the biggest thing when I say when building a team, and working with your team is to surround yourself with people with skill sets that you don't have, and be willing to embrace moments where you don't know what's going on, like where you don't have all the answers. That's why you have a team, right? To help
Mm-hmm.
fill. And so I think for me, being with the team that I'm on right now, gives me a lot of confidence, because we support each other not only, with the project, but in our personal lives as well. And we are great friends, offline. We check in on each other. We make sure that, when one of us has to tab out for a week, that there are others there to step up. And it's about finding a healthy balance of kind of people who love to ideate and love to learn. I think that's the big. I feel like a
Mm-hmm.
lot of that when you have a team that they should come with a set of skills, and I feel that that's almost a mistake,
Mm-hmm.
because there are that would be amazing, right? Ideally, you have a team with that checks all the boxes. They have all the skills and they're all very, well versed in their different talents. Um, but often in those situations, you don't always find people who are willing to grow
Mm-hmm.
because they feel very good about where they're at right now. And I'm not saying this is the case with everybody, it very much isn't. But most often than not, I find that it's much more important to find people who love to learn. I feel like no matter who you are, what, your age, your grade, kind of other personal life details, or degrees or whatever, like no matter what, if you have the will, the energy, and almost hunger to learn, you're going to make it happen. And I think that's very core to kind of the philosophy of my team and also myself, in a sense of like nothing truly is impossible to achieve. Um,
Hmm.
and if you put your mind to it, you can learn almost anything out there. Like that's the beauty of the internet. That's the beauty of YouTube. In a world, social media where we're connected with endless individuals that we can email or, set up a Zoom call like this and, ask questions. It's almost it's very doable. So I think that's what makes, especially in this day and age, young people very able and very equipped, I think, to pursue projects like this, and projects even bigger, because we have so many resources at our fingertips and so
Yes.
much energy. I feel like that's definitely a characteristic that, I think is very admirable of the youth demographic, is that we're so incredibly energized, that anything truly is achievable.
I love that. I love that you mentioned assembling a team of learners rather than experts. And I think that's something that we should definitely keep in mind that societies in general should think about because you're right. There is if you assemble a group of people who all have a set amount of knowledge, that's great. But there is not that room for innovation that is really necessary, especially in STEM fields, because STEM at its core is innovation. So if you don't have a team of people willing to take those risks and make those mistakes and embrace those mistakes as chances to grow, then you're not going to get anywhere. So I really like that you characterize your team that way. And I'm so glad to hear that that's worked for you because I agree, especially when you're doing such a project as what you're doing, you need people to rely on and work with and people who bring different skills that you don't have, and who can teach you those skills. So I really appreciate your insights on building a team and things like that. And um, just to sort of wrap up here as we're nearing the end, um, in thinking about your journey as a woman in STEM, as a young woman, as a young advocate, do you have any advice beyond what you've already given to anybody of those identities? You can choose all of them or one in particular. Um, that's advice that you would give to them based on the things that you've learned throughout your own journey.
Mm, so many things. If I had to pick one thing out, um, probably say definitely be you. Be as authentically you as possible because nobody else is going to be that. And I think that's what makes you unique. Whether it's the
Mhm.
skills that you bring to the table or the way that you vocalize your opinions or, stand up for things that you believe in, I think, your biggest, thing is your personal brand. And
Mhm.
I just know that, and I think that that's something that brings a lot of confidence. I think is very core to, how I kind of build my confidence in a sense of, I am who I am, and granted, like the parts of me that have kind of grown and learned throughout the year are drawn from the community that I'm a part of, and
Mhm.
also recognizing that and kind of humbling yourself, is very very key as well. But I think biggest advice would be just be authentically you. Yeah, for sure.
I love that. I love that. And that's something I definitely can see in your answers tonight, that you do understand who you are very deeply and you understand how important it is to know yourself when you're trying to fight for yourself. Because how can you fight for your place in the world? How can you advocate that you belong somewhere if you don't know what you bring and if you don't know who you are? So I love that you are really highlighting that, and that and embodying that in your own work and your own life. So thank you for that advice and thank you for your time tonight. This was a great conversation, and I personally very inspired myself. And I cannot wait to see where Sensible goes and just where your journey continues to go, because you definitely are on an incredible path. And thank you for taking the time to talk with me today.
Thank you for this incredible opportunity and also the work that you're doing with the sisterhood. We can't wait to see what's in store.
Thank you so much and have a great night.
Thank you. You too.